Okay, I will be slowly starting. People will be joining. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining from. I'm joining from Krakow. Jason is joining from Atlanta. You are guys joining from all over the place. Welcome to Zoom. This is the second meeting. Second online meeting arranged by the Galicia Jewish Museum. This time we have a huge privilege to have Jason Francisco with us. Jason Francisco is an amazing photographer, essayist, researcher, lecturer, professor who spent 20, 30 years now photographing in Poland. He is involved with the Galicia Jewish Museum, of which I'm a curator. He's a co-author of our core exhibition. In 2016, we updated the exhibition, which was originally prepared by Chris Schwartz and Jonathan Weber, with the photographs amazing photographs made by Jason Francisco. And today, Jason will be giving us a lecture called "Photography and the Shoah." This lecture is a part of a bigger program. It's a public project financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the competition Public Diplomacy 2020 New Dimension. The main component of this program is a mobile application that we launched 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now, which I encourage you to download and use. You can get links to this application on our website, and probably you will get an email after the seminar with the links. Every few days we publish just one single photograph from the Polish Jewish history, one photograph connected with the history of Polish Jews, from mid-19th century all the way to contemporary projects, with a short text explaining the context of this photograph. Yes, at the very end of this meeting, there will be very short survey popping up on your screen. It will literally take 1 minute to answer the question. So if you will be so kind and do it, I will really appreciate that. And Jason, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Bardzo dziękuję Tomek za miłe zaproszenie. I'm very happy to be here with you as always. And some of you may have seen the exhibitions at the Galicia Jewish Museum. If you haven't seen them, then please, when it's safe to do so, make your way to Krakow and spend time in the museum. It's a wonderful resource for Poland and for all of Europe, for all of us. Okay, we're all living in Zoom half the time, it seems, in this moment. And I am no different than that, although I have to say I have given very few lectures by way of Zoom, so this is a bit of a new thing for me. I've prepared a set of pictures to show you, and a set of questions or comments, ideas about how to read them, how to approach them. And so what I'd like to do today is share my screen with the group, and so you'll see that rather than me. And let's try to do that right now. By the way, I can see you, Tomek. I can't see anyone else. Okay, so let's try.
This is how it works with the webinar format.
This is the webinar format. Okay. Okay. Now, are you in my screen? See the lead slide here, correct?
It's all fine.
Okay, good. Yes, okay, so What I'd like to do today is to, as I said, to take you through some of the collective archive, I guess what we could call the collective archive of uh, images that were made during the Shoah, the genocide of Europe's Jews during the Second World War. And in my mind, if we're speaking about the Shoah and the image archive, it makes sense to begin before the war with the pre-war image of Jewish life, or let's say one of the most well-known photographically derived bodies of work that give image to the way that Jewish life was on the eve of the Shoah. And the most, I think the readiest place to begin here is with the work of this photographer, Roman Bishnyak, who was a Russian-born photographer who traveled to Berlin in the early 1930s to begin medical studies there. Was an amateur photographer and joint distribution committee to travel into the parts of Jewish Europe that he didn't know very well, although he was originally Russian. That is to travel into Poland and to photograph Jewish life in Poland. And he did that in a series of trips in the middle 1930s that, in retrospect, turn out to be the best, most complete, and most, in a sense, individualistic vision, the most complete individual vision of pre-war Jewish life. Those of you who have any image of pre-war Jewish life in Poland, you might well be influenced by Roman Vishnyak's image, and especially if you've been to the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you might remember that there is actually a single room that is entirely dedicated to Vishnyak's photographs, almost like a kind of temple to Bishnyak. This is how important his work has become in memory. The photographs that we remember best from Roman Bishnyak are pictures that are characterized by a distinct intimacy with their subject. And I would point out as a leading example this photograph of a grandfather and a granddaughter, a picture that is remarkably tender and a kind of a moment of some kind of intimate exchange of words from one generation to another generation. Bishnyak, I assume Bishnyak didn't know either of them, but he approached them with a certain kind of receptivity. I would call it an extraordinary sensitivity. And the image that he makes here is really quite deep. I could spend some time reading it and reading from it. But I would just note maybe in shorthand that we have two figures and then we have the space between those two figures, a kind of hourglass-like shape. And the sense of both a moment on one hand and a sort of indeterminate duration of time that maybe spans generations is, I think, indicated by the way that Bishnyak went about making this photograph. Vishnyak's pictures often take us into interior spaces that seem remarkable, as if a kind of remarkable access has been achieved. This is one of his best known photographs of a young girl who has spent an entire winter inside her family's basement house, and we see her in her bed with a set of a mural of flowers painted by her father on the wall behind her. Bishnyak especially relished photographing the religious life of the communities that he was traveling through. And he photographs, for example, school children studying in a cheder, a Jewish school in a kind of delicately lit room at collective tables with their texts. Altogether, this image of Jewish life as being intimate, religiously active, mystical even, somehow hidden, a bit secluded. This really characterizes the vision that Bishnyak found when he went to travel in Eastern Europe, and I think that it's part of what made Bishnyak's pictures retroactively so powerful as a tool for memory of Jewish life. In other words, there's something very precious in the way that Bishnyak goes about photographing these religious communities, and that preciousness reads, in the aftermath of the genocide, that preciousness reads as even more precious. And it's no coincidence, for example, that this is the photograph that Bishnyak uses for his best-known book, which is published in the early 1980s under the title A Vanished World. So Bishnyak made these pictures in the 1930s and didn't publish. He published a small volume of them in the late 1940s in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, but it wasn't until the early 1980s, actually in the midst of a wave of post-war photographic projects about remnant Jewish communities, one of them being Chuck Fishman's project. Hi, Chuck, I don't know if you're here watching. I know Chuck was in conversation with Tomek a few days ago. But in the midst of this kind of moment of revisitation of Jewish communities in the 70s and into the 80s, Bishnyak publishes A Vanished World, which becomes the totemic study of pre-war Jewish life. And I would say an iconic study. It becomes quickly an iconic image. The foreword by Elie Wiesel goes some distance, I think, towards establishing that status through staircases and steps or receding streets, archways. Bishnyak gives image to the idea of the Jewish world as insular in Krakow. Those of you who know the city will recognize that this is the passageway between Józefa and Majzelca streets in Kazimierz. Bishnyak mistitles this photograph The Entrance to the Ghetto. And this mistitling is actually quite indicative of Bishnyak's reading. There was no ghetto at the time that Bishnyak photographed in Kazimierz. There was an ancient Jewish neighborhood, which is where he was, but there was no ghetto. But in Bishnyak's imagination, in his retroactive imagination in the 1980s, he gave that kind of spin to his images. Even more the case, if you look carefully at Bishnyak's archive, you'll see that there's a certain image of the Jewish figure that Bishnyak gravitates toward. And this is specifically the old religious Jew in a long coat, with a hat, often bearded. Bishnyak photographs over and over again. He photographs older, religious, bearded Jews. And these people form a kind of, I guess you could say, a kind of motif or a trope in his book. You could say that he pins his image of Jewishness, of pre-war Jewishness, to these particular Jews. And ask the question, why? And I would suggest that part of the reason Bishnyak is attracted to them as an emblem of Jewishness goes back a lot of decades into the deep history of photography of Jews in Eastern Europe. And it's often the case that religious Jews become a kind of type. We see here two images by Ignacy Krieger, who's a photographer from Krakow, actually quite a complex photographer whose work I'd like someday to see become an exhibition somewhere, maybe the Galicia Jewish Museum. But in the 19th century, we have many typical or what becomes stereotypical images of bearded religious Jews that come to stand for the Jew. And so, without knowing exactly how this might have happened, it would seem to me that there's a kind of image environment that Bishnyak lived in which Jewish authenticity or Jewish tradition becomes associated with a certain type of physical image, as I say, and this is, by the way, this is not only in European Jews, this is also coming from photographs that are made of Jews in other places, in Palestine, in Yemeni Jews, Mizrahi Jews. And it seems that it's not accidental that when photographers with the invading Nazi armies begin to photograph Jews in towns and cities that they occupy, they often are attracted to these kinds of Jewish bodies, these kinds of Jewish figures. We see a direct connection, in other words, between what is a kind of typical Jewish image that comes from the history of photography with what becomes propaganda, Nazi propaganda, during the time of the war. So that we have, for example, one of a famous Nazi propaganda film, Der Ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, whose poster is exactly this kind of image that becomes associated with anti-Jewish stereotypes. As I mentioned, Bishnyak himself came from an assimilated, from a Russian Jewish family that was in fact an assimilated Russian Jewish family. And to begin to understand the context in which Bishnyak's imaging of Jews occurs, it might be useful to look at some of Bishnyak's family's own photographs. So on the left here, we have Roman Bishnyak's grandfather, Wolf, and his father, Solomon. Wolf on the left and Solomon on the right. And on the right, we see a picture of Bishnyak's parents, Solomon and his mother, Manya. And you can see that in the photograph of his grandfather, we can immediately see a generational shift in appearance between the older, more traditional looking Wolf and the assimilated image of his father, Solomon. And it turns out that the visual archive that we have of Jewish life from the very period that Bishnyak was working in a little bit before turns out to look quite varied. We have Jews whose outward appearance looks entirely assimilated into the countries in which they're living. Here's a photograph by a local photographer from the Polish town of Szczecin, a man named Zalman Kaplan, whose archive was published a couple of years ago. A group of young at all like the images that we find in Bishnyak's photographs or in the anthropological typologic photographs that preceded them. We have images from, for example, Menachem Kipnis of groups of young Jews reading Yiddish newspapers. We have actresses, we have Jewish men who are government employees. We have Bundists, we have Jewish workers whose vision of Jewish life is, if anything, anti-religious. We have Jewish athletes in which the body, the healthy body, is a critical element of their identities. We have Zionists, we have Jews learning to farm. The fire brigade from the town of Szczecin, many of whom are Jews, but we don't know who. And I find this to be quite, and we have a kind of shared communityhood, shared community of people, Poles and Jews together serving in their town. The distinctions between Jews and Poles are not important in this case. Okay, so all of this is to sort of to preface the situation of the archive of the Holocaust that we have, the visual archive of the Holocaust. And I feel that just in the interest of sort of responsibility, that I don't want to assume what anyone here does or doesn't know about the Holocaust. Of course, I can't teach the Holocaust in this format, but there are certain notorious elements that I think many people are familiar with, although maybe not in terms of the scale or scope of those elements. So here's a map, for example, that shows one of the best known elements of the Holocaust, the ghettoization of Jews. And we see here how vast it was. It extended from Eastern Germany all the way through Ukraine and Belarus, up into Lithuania. Likewise, this is a map that was produced by Yachad and Unum, which is a contemporary organization conducting forensic research into the killing sites of Jews in the occupied, mostly in the occupied Soviet Union, which was for those of you who've studied the history of the Holocaust, the murder, the physical annihilation of Jews actually began in the East and moved west. So most of it began in after June 1941, when the Germans breached the non-aggression treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union. They invade the Soviet Union, and there are mobile killing squads that are moving east with the German troops that are killing Jews in massacres where they live. And there are many hundreds of such sites that are scattered across the countryside in Ukraine and in Belarus and Latvia and in Lithuania. The US Holocaust Museum released the results of a study that had taken several years to complete, in which they set out to do a simple thing, which was to just compile a list of all the locations where the events that we collectively call the Holocaust occurred. And when they began, they thought that they had most of them. They had around 6,000 such locations. And when they finished, they had a list of more than 42, which is an astonishing revelation, at least I think it is. And what it suggests is that the Holocaust, if we really look at it, was a highly decentralized event. Without exception, every corner of occupied Europe was touched by the events that we call the Holocaust in one way or another. In other words, if you were to think of this in metaphoric terms, if you could imagine the entire continent covered by a sheet of glass, and the Holocaust as the shattering of that sheet of glass, shards of that sheet would be found everywhere. And this is the reality of the Holocaust. So in terms of history, scholars often sort of periodize the Holocaust into three major clusters of events from 1933 to 1939, which is the time mostly of political and legal discrimination against German Jews and the appropriation of the assets of German Jews. Between 1939 and 1941, we have the major movement of confinement and isolation of Jews into ghettos and into camps. And then between 1941 and 1945 is the main period of the physical annihilation of Europe's Jews. And we can break them down roughly into three categories. This period of annihilation, 1 million people killed in ghettos from starvation, disease, privation, another 1.5 million people killed in the open air massacres in the occupied Soviet Union, and then another 3.5 million people killed in the camp system, of which the best known is Auschwitz, Birkenau, but there are many, many others also. So one thing that is of relevance to thinking about the photography of the Holocaust is the question of how to name these events. The Nazis had their own name. They called it the so-called final solution. solution to what? The solution to the problem of Jewish existence in the world. That name is obviously no longer used except as a historical reference to the Nazis' own policies and agenda. For a while, the word Auschwitz was used for the entirety of these events as a metonym, that is, as a kind of a stand-in for the whole. In 1944, the term crimes against humanity was invented, meaning the systematic killing of individual people, the systematic killing of individuals. In 1944, also the word genocide was invented. In Hebrew, the term Churban Europa was sometimes used to describe the destruction of the European Jews. And then we have the word Holocaust, which comes from the Greek, meaning sacrificial, to sacrifice something by fire. That is a redemptive term that some people have argued with because it somehow suggests a kind of recuperation and gives meaning to what in many people's views was an utterly meaningless set of deaths. And then we have the Hebrew word Shoah, meaning simply catastrophe. In recent years, we also have the word Nazi genocide, and this term begins to expand the frame of reference of what we mean by Nazi killing to include other people, not just Jewish victims of Nazism. And there are many such people who were also targeted: Roma, Slavic peoples, ideological opponents of the Nazi regime, communists and socialists, also people deemed to be in various ways racially subhuman, homosexuals, and people with mental illness and so forth. So there are many terms to refer to these events, which leads to the question, what about visual names? What about thinking of the visual archive as its own set of names? And if we begin to think this way, then the word name itself, we can parse the word name itself, which maybe begins to shed some light on the ways that images function as names. So when we use the word, when we say the word name, we can mean one of many things. We can mean an act of distinguishing something from something else, an act of specifying something, an act of representing. This leads me to a set of questions, which I've written out here. Under what conditions do images become names? Are imagistic names like or unlike other kinds of names? How do imagistic names actually function? Are they stable over time? Are they unstable over time? How should we read imagistic names? And how do we pronounce them, as it were? And this, what I have here coming is, in a sense, I guess, an effort to pronounce those names. And it seems to me reasonable to begin, given the history that we're talking about, by asking about the ways that photographs stabilize the events that they refer to. And to think about the photographs this way, we might set up a kind of a loose chronology of events from the Shoah and look for photographs that stand iconically in a sort of stabilizing way for those events. For example, in 1933, we have a famous book burning at the Opera Square in Berlin, of which we have this photograph. In 1935, the race laws, the Nuremberg race laws, are decreed, and this decree is incorporated into a famous propaganda film, Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will. This is a still image from that film. In 1938, the beginning of the physical destruction of Europe's Jews comes with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which is an organized set of pogroms across Germany and that involved the burning and looting of Jewish businesses, also Jewish communal buildings like synagogues and Jewish homes. Also, in 1939 comes the announcement of Hitler's determination to exterminate the Jews. And he makes this pronouncement in making the case for war to the Reichstag. Here is a photograph of that speech with Hitler here. You can see, can you see my arrow here on the screen? There's Hitler here this is a photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto. One photograph from the period of that ghetto's existence that shows something about life on the street during that time. The massacre of Jews by the Einsatzgruppe and the roving execution squads. We have photographs of that. This is a photograph that was made in Latvia, Liepaja, and the coast of Latvia. By the way, I should have said earlier, and I'll say this now, I suppose it may be obvious to that we'll be looking at difficult images over the course of this talk. I suppose that many of you will have anticipated that, but in case you didn't, by definition, I suppose the photography of the Holocaust includes many very difficult images to look at. The previous one is, to this point, the most graphic of them. The mass transport of Jews to camps. This is a photograph made of a transport of Jews to the camp. By 1944, we have Auschwitz functioning at top capacity as a death factory. And there are a series of photographs of people waiting on the train platforms at the Birkenau camp, just imported from Hungary. This photograph and many from this album stand for the what happened in that camp specifically, and to the extent that that camp remains a metonym, what happened in the Holocaust more generally. And then we have the press photographs, the journalists' photographs of the aftermath, the liberation photographs. This one from Buchenwald, made in the spring of 1945. So we could go through each year and come up with a set of emblematic pictures this way. On the other hand, mentioned, I would say that even though the Holocaust is a very highly documented, visually documented event, there are many, many more things that happened of which there are no photographs. And as an acknowledgement of that, we could say, for example, that we could ask, well, what about the other camps, not Auschwitz, but say Belzec, which was a camp that was operating for less than a year. Around 600,000, 500 to 600,000 people were murdered. There were 2 survivors. There are no photographs of what happened at Belzec. Most of the Jews from the historical province of Galicia, that is the place where in the Galicia Jewish Museum's exhibitions address, most of them were murdered not at Auschwitz, but at Belzec. We have no photographs of what happened at Belzec. Outside of Krakow, in the orbit of shtetls outside of Krakow, is a town called Jaworzyce. Well, there were 20,000 Jews deported from Jaworzyce to Belzec in the fall of 1942. There's not a single photograph of what happened in this one town. And you can extrapolate from that, that there are no photographs for hundreds and hundreds of other towns. About an hour to the east of Krakow is the town of Tarnów. And in June 1942, outside of Tarnów, in a tiny village in the mountains in Zbilitotska Góra, 7,000 people were massacred on a single day, shot into pits. There's not a single photograph of what happened at Zbilitotska Góra. Also in the region of Tarnów, a tiny place, Albiguva, a tiny place, 62 Jews were killed in this place in 9 separate massacres between 1942 and 1943. We don't have a single photograph of anything that happened to these Jews in Albiguva. And so altogether, what we're talking about when we talk about the history of the photographs of the Holocaust, we're talking about a tiny, tiny representation of the events that actually happened collectively across occupied Europe. Now, the best collection of photographs, the most complete collection of photographs that we have of the Holocaust was actually produced by the perpetrators. And of the photographs that the perpetrators produced, I would say that there are sort of roughly 2 main categories of them. There's the use of photography as an official disciplinary tool and as a representation of the power of the regime. And then we have photography as an unofficial and sometimes an undisciplined force or action that's occurring within the occupation, within the regime. And so I'd like to show you examples of both of these groups of images, and in general to set out for you a kind of interpretive scheme which is going to sit in the background of several groups of photographs that I have to show you coming. We can think about these photographs along 2 continua, I think. One continuum is defined by images in which violence is shown directly in the image and the absence of the direct image of violence. The other continuum is defined by the sanction of the photograph, whether it's an official or a formal institutional sanction, or whether it's an informal or unofficial or personal, private sanction. And so if you cross these 2 continua, then we have kind of 4 baskets within which we can locate images to the extent that this is useful. We have official images in which violence is shown. We have unofficial images in which violence is shown. We have official images in which violence is not shown directly, and we have unofficial images in which violence is not shown. And you'll see that there are images of all of these kinds. It seems fit that we have photographs that Germans made of themselves during Kristallnacht in November 1938. So these are state-organized pogroms, and the pogromists took the trouble to photograph their work, their actions. So when they attack a Jewish-owned shop, they attack it and then they pose in front of it. They photograph themselves doing these attacks. And the act of photography here is a kind of confirmation of power and of efficacy. We see here also a crowd gathered to watch, or as it were, to participate silently. We have German photographers during Kristallnacht photographing the victims. They batter their way into people's apartments in the middle of the night, beat them, terrorize them, and photograph them, looting the apartments of Jews whose possessions are coveted, wanted, stolen. And we have even photographs of pogromists setting synagogues on fire. So when the Germans reach the city of Lemberg, Lviv, in late June, early July 1941, they stage a pogrom, and they film that pogrom. They film it with cinema cameras. They film it with still cameras. And this pogrom involves the roundup of Jews from several neighborhoods in the city, and the public marching of these people through the streets of the city to several prison sites that were in the center of the city, and which are still in the center of the city. And so here we see an even more graphic example of the use of photography to aid and abet and document, and from the Nazis' point of view, celebrate the torture and abuse that they were inflicting on people as they were doing it. Now, I would say that probably the most extensive set of photographs that we have from the perpetrator's point of view comes from the period of the Warsaw Ghetto, and there are several distinct strands of pictures that we have. This is a map that shows the extent of the ghetto in the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943. This was a huge section of the center of Warsaw, and the Germans set about immediately creating propaganda photographs of life in the ghetto. It was important to them to create a false image of ghetto life as being prosperous, normal, of Jews as living in some kind of state of self-determination, in which life more or less went on as normal. So we would have images of nightclubs, of Jews working, well-fed, seemingly healthy people. Mail delivery goes on as normal. We have an orderly and disciplined Jewish police force that is that's active in the ghetto. We have street markets with plenty of food, baskets of bread. We have happy children selling the mandatory armbands and identifying markers. We have Jewish religious life going on as normal. All of this is fake. All of this is staged. All of this is false. We have a series of photographs from independent sources. These are semi-official collections of pictures made by individual Nazis who decided to photograph life in the Warsaw Ghetto without exactly being told to do so. One of the best of these known of these collections is by a man named Heinrich Jurst, and he made his way through the ghetto in the summer of 1941 and photographed the very things about ghetto life that the propagandists left out. That is explicit misery and immiseration and suffering on the streets of the ghetto. People dying in public view, people starving, people abandoned, children abandoned, people who have basically been left for dead. They're not being attended, they're not being cared for, people buried in mass graves in the Jewish cemetery. And for a person like Jurst, Jurst was an unrepentant Nazi, and probably his own view of these photographs was a kind of confirmation of Jewish weakness, of Jewish racial weakness. These were not photographs that were made as an expose of the crime of ghettoization. Rather, they were photographs that were made for the purpose of showing just how poorly Jews could survive the situation that they were in. Of course, nobody could survive that situation. We also have another collection of photographs from a photographer named Willy Georg, another Nazi, who in the summer of 1941 also made his way through the Warsaw Ghetto and photographed a bit differently than Jurst did. Jurst has a distinctly kind of distant view, an object-like view of the figures that he encounters in the street, Georg was somehow capable of getting closer to his subjects as human beings, and even managing to show things that, say, a Jewish photographer, had there been one working in the Warsaw Ghetto, probably couldn't have shown. So, for example, Georg, on the single afternoon in which he took his Leica through the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto in July 1941, was wearing a uniform, and it was required that Jews take off their hats as an act of acknowledgement or respect for a uniformed Nazi. You can see that that's exactly what's happening in this photograph, although the scowl and contempt on the look on the face of the man taking off his hat is also quite visible. Here we see an encounter with a stereotypically, by this point, weak Jew, singled out in the midst of the sidewalk begging, although unlike Jost, he meets him eye to eye in a certain sense. Somehow Georg manages to photograph in such a way that he allows a little bit of the sense of what confinement in this ghetto meant from the points of view of the victims. And there are other examples in which that's even more the case. So, for example, another Nazi photographer, Hugo Jäger, went into the ghetto in Kutno at one point and made photographs in color. And his photographs, his color photographs, have a quality of intimacy almost, or aliveness or respect almost, for his Jewish subjects. There's a kind of an acknowledgement that's taking place of the humanity of his subjects across the power divide that exists between them. Now, there's also a great deal of unofficial photography that's practiced by soldiers and by uniformed Nazis. This is an image that, for me, emblematizes some of that. We see here the hanging of a partisan that's being attended by a group of Wehrmacht soldiers. So these are not SS, these are ordinary German soldiers. And one of them, as you can see, is photographing. In the center, you can see he's making a photograph of this hanging for his own album or his own purposes. And we find quite a lot of this, photographs of this kind. These are pictures that are more or less anonymous at this point. They're made from the standpoint of bystanders who are also perpetrators, or they're somehow in a slippery zone of movement between perpetrator and bystander. Those of you who know the city of Lviv will recognize this as the train bridge that goes over Zamarstanivska Street today. We have albums, post-war albums, in which German soldiers and officers have snapshots of the events that they participated in. The rounding up of Jews. This is probably from Krakow in 1942. This is Szydłowiec in Poland. They're ordinary snapshots that were made of victims during the act of rounding up and deporting them. These are photographs that you could call keepsakes of a kind, but I find that among all of the types of photographs that we have from the history of the Holocaust, these photographs are made by untrained photographers or people using cameras, often for the simplest purposes, and the photographs that result are often ambiguous. They're often visually ambiguous. in ways that turn out to be expressive and also emotionally charged. I have a collection of, I have quite a large collection of these photographs that I've amassed over the years. I'd like to show some of them to you. And these are pictures, many of them are not identified or not yet identified. And you'll see that they're difficult to read, they're difficult to discern, and some of that difficulty ends up conveying the quality of terror and of the quality of the events that were happening at this moment. I'm going to just go through some of them without speaking. So in other words, to put the point differently, the fact that we have photographs of these events does not necessarily clarify the meanings of these events. Sometimes the photographs end up begging many questions about what it is that we're looking at, what exactly happened, who did it, who was the victim of it. It's often the case with this body of photographs that the photographs represent a kind of paradox in that they represent a direct testimony, a direct visual testimony to something that happened, and yet that testimony is opaque or difficult to understand, or maybe even impossible to understand. Like the photograph that we're looking at now, we're looking at how many bodies are we looking at? It's very difficult to say by virtue of the photograph itself. And I think you can see that from many of the previous photographs, some of even the most basic factual information about these events is hard to discern. By the time, to return to the Warsaw Ghetto, by the time the ghetto is being liquidated, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising has broken out in the spring of 1943, and the Germans have decided to quash the uprising and to root out all of the Jewish fighters and to demolish the ghetto. And they go about doing that, and they photograph their way through that process. So here we have an example of what you could call today embedded photography, in which the photographer acts as a member of the German stormtroopers who are lighting buildings on fire, who are going into basements and dugouts and pulling out resistors and fighters and partisans, or people in hiding. And they photograph their way through these events triumphantly. The act of photographing is, from this point of view, a kind of triumph for them. It's a confirmation of what they've accomplished in their terms. Now, the photography of Auschwitz itself is another important chapter in the official history of the official history, or the history of photography from the perpetrator's point of view. We have an album, a remarkable album made by a still unknown photographer on the train platforms of Birkenau in 1944. This is the platform which is iconic now today. The gate that was built specifically for the massive deportation of Hungarian Jews, unloaded hundreds of thousands of people in 1944 who waited in long lines. And we have a case of a photographer, probably a German photographer, although it's not entirely certain that that's the case, who photographed these people. And from these photographs, we can see a great deal about what happened on that train platform. For example, in this photograph, we can see the front of the line, and we see the selection process. We see people being sent either to the left, where they wind up in another line waiting for asphyxiation and cremation, although they don't know this at that point, or they're sent to the right for labor. This is the very point of the decision by the camp commanders about who lives and who dies. And the camp leadership was also photographing itself at the same time. And we have, for example, we have an album of people who worked at the Auschwitz camp relaxing in a kind of bucolic rural setting, taking a vacation, eating blueberries and playing the accordion, enjoying themselves on a break from work. This is a self-depiction now of the war from the German point of view. This is what these people wanted to remember about their vacation time from working in the camp. And then, of course, on the other side, we have a vast archive of camp-made photographs, which are I suppose, the strictest definition of the disciplinary photograph, and a straightforward index of power exerted on prisoners by virtue of photography or through photography. We have a kind of recording of prisoners made from 3 points of view in a formulaic way, and purely identifying strategy in which photography is used to record the images of people who are imprisoned in the camp. And without going into this, there's a huge archive of these photographs that exist. Okay, what about the victim's point of view? Do we have photographs from the point of view of those who were the targets of the Holocaust? Yes, we do. And in this case, we have the use of photography as an official tool for survival by Jews who were on the receiving end of Nazi atrocities. And we also have photography as an unofficial tool of resistance. And the same two-way continuum, I think, can be used to understand this. The best example of photography from the victim's point of view is the example of a photographer from the ghetto in Łódź, which was the longest existing ghetto in occupied Poland. Łódź had been manufacturing center before the war. Sometimes I called the Manchester of Poland. Huge manufacturing center. And the Łódź Ghetto existed in the northern part of central Łódź, in the Bołuty section of the city. It was a huge area. And among those people who were confined to the ghetto in Łódź was a young painter, an artist by the name of Mendel Grossman. Grossman was from Łódź, and when the ghetto was established, he was confined in the ghetto along with the rest of his family. And here we see on the left a family portrait of Mendel in the center, and his two sisters and his mother and his father. And actually you'll notice, just looking at this family picture, something similar to what we saw in the case of the family picture of Roman Bishnyaks, father and grandfather. We see a generational change in appearance between the older and the younger generations, which reflects different points in the process of Jewish life and assimilation into Polish culture, Polish society. The leader of the ghetto in Łódź was a notorious figure in the history of the Holocaust named Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski. And Rumkowski was an autocrat. He ruled the Warsaw Ghetto as the head of the Jewish Council with an iron hand, and he was widely disliked, sometimes even despised by Jews in the ghetto. And it was important for Rumkowski to have an official photographer to document his activities, his visits to various places in the ghetto, his speech making, and so forth. And Mendel Grossman was a self-taught photographer and got himself hired by the Jewish Council to make official photographs for Rumkowski and for Rumkowski's strategy for Jewish survival, which was basically to make Jews useful. Rumkowski thought that Jews had the best chance of surviving if they could actually do something that the Germans needed, which is to say, to work. And so he created a set of factories that were intensely productive. And part of Grossman's job, the main point of Grossman's job, was to photograph labor. It was to make images that would help to prove to the Germans why Jews were necessary to the German war effort. And it was for this reason that Grossman was given a supply of film, that he was given a dark room and access to the chemistry he needed, and so forth and so forth. And Grossman went about making these photographs as he was asked. But he also did other things, as many photographers are wont to do. He did his own things at the same time. And he decided that he wanted to photograph what it was like to be confined into the Łódź Ghetto and what the realities were like, to chronicle the Łódź Ghetto visually and to create a standing account, a standing document of exactly what happened from the victim's point of view. He began with his own family. The simple thing of photographing his father eating. Hunger was pervasive in all the ghettos. Desperate hunger was pervasive. Obtaining food, obtaining enough food was difficult or impossible for everyone. And the act of photographing his father eating a piece of bread turned out to be his starting place. And you can see the ravenousness with which his father eats this bread. He photographed people eating constantly, or people not having enough to eat. He photographs a child who can't wait to get out of the cold snowbank to eat a bowl of soup. He photographs people who can't wait to sit down even, or people who give their soup to somebody else. He photographs people copying down ration notices or ration information. He photographs Jewish self-help and Jewish organization in the ghetto that allowed people to a measure of survival. Community kitchens, community cafeterias, Jewish workers taking a break to eat. He photographs the distribution of bread. Finally, when his father makes a kind of decision that he's no longer going to attempt to survive, and he puts on his tefillin and his talis and sits with his prayer book to death, and so that his family can survive, and Grossman photographs that. One of the most important sub-themes in Grossman's archive is the effort to keep disease from spreading in the ghetto. And in this connection, people who collected and hauled shit were among the most important people for collective survival in the ghetto. And Grossman photographs them diligently. These people are heroes in the context of the ghetto. It's practically a death sentence to work collecting excrement, and Grossman photographs them with a full knowledge of their sacrifice. Grossman photographs the opening and closing of gates that allow people to pass. That is the nature of the confinement, the physical confinement within the space of the ghetto. He even photographs his captors. He photographs here the German changing of the guard in the ghetto. Now, Grossman did all of this work, and he was extremely diligent. He was known to not only to make these photographs, but to make many copies of these pictures, to annotate them, to organize them, and to distribute them to people. At a certain point, the word of Grossman's work made its way to Rumkowski, and Rumkowski actually sent an official letter to Grossman forbidding him from using Jewish council materials, film and camera supplies, for this purpose. Grossman promised he wouldn't do it anymore and kept doing it. One of the most impactful strains in Grossman's archive is the deportations into and out of the Łódź Ghetto, which Grossman photographed also diligently, both from a distance and up close, walking with people being deported into and out of the ghetto, walking among them. He photographed Jewish police in their role as enforcers of deportation orders. He photographed whole families undergoing deportation. Here we have a family on the other side of a fence. Presumably these are people who are about to be deported onto trains and sent to Chełmno, dictating a letter to a child still on the ghetto side of the fence. He photographs a woman fervently writing a last letter while waiting to be pushed onto a train. He photographs people kissing through the fence, a last kiss. He photographs the aftermath of the deportations, the despair, and he photographs the loading of the trains themselves. It was extremely dangerous to attempt to do. He actually photographs the process of the pushing people into the trains, During the roundups that were going on with the deportations, many people were killed in the ghetto. And of course, many people were dying also of starvation and disease. And so he does something else also. He begins to go to the morgue and to photograph the corpses in the morgue with the thought of identifying bodies and being able to get some kind of image to the families of people who had died. This is done entirely illegally, against the rules of the Jewish Council, that is, and at the risk of his own life. He photographed in the streets, often with an overcoat, with his camera hidden under the overcoat. This is a picture of Grossman made by one of his assistants, another photographer named Henrik Ross, whose work has also come to light in recent years and is actually quite, in certain ways, distinct from Grossman's work. This is a portrait of Grossman made by Ross with his overcoat. The story of what happened to Mendel Grossman and his archive is worth noting. Grossman's father, as I said, did not survive the war. His mother did not survive the war. His sister Fega did not survive the war. But Grossman himself came close to surviving the war. He was still in Łódź at the end of 1944 when the ghetto was being liquidated, and he was sent on a death march west towards Germany. Didn't survive the death march, died in a snowbank somewhere along the way, I like to say with his Leica in his hand, still photographing. But before he left Łódź, he had organized a collection of his work, of his images, into a set of cans that he put into the walls of the apartment that they lived in the city. His sister Ruzhka survived the war, and after the war, she went back to their apartment. She managed to get Mendel's work, and she took it with her to a DP camp, and then eventually she went to Palestine and found herself living in a kibbutz in southern Palestine, near the Negev desert. And when the Israeli War of Independence broke out in 1948, this kibbutz was overrun by the Egyptian army, and Grossman's work was destroyed. And so what we have here, what I have, and what all of us have, is a tiny fraction of what Mendel Grossman actually made. He, as I said, he made a point of making copies of his pictures, and he sent them out to, he gave them to people, and they've somehow, individual pictures have somehow survived. A definitive study of Mendel Grossman's life and work and a complete collection of his pictures has yet to be published. That's a project for someone to do. It's probably a years-long project. But slowly over decades, Mendel Grossman's legacy and his work has become somewhat more recognized and more known. In Berlin, underneath the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in the center of the city, next to not far from the Brandenburg Gate, there's a museum with a small mini exhibition to Mendel Grossman that's included in that museum. Now, we also have, I should mention, I don't really have time to go into all of this, but there are examples of images that were made by prisoners at Auschwitz, Birkenau, also by members of the Jewish underground at Birkenau. This is probably the best known such image. This was made in the summer of 1944 at the perimeter of the Birkenau camp. Those of you who may have been to Birkenau, you know that it's a huge place, and it was basically swampland that was cleared and dredged by prisoners. And at the very edges of the camp, there are still, even today, there are still kind of like swampy, marshy lagoons that existed. And at the time, in the summer of 1944, the killing was going on at such a furious rate that the crematoria at Birkenau could not handle the burning of all the bodies, and so there were open air pyres of corpses that were set, and this was a photograph made next to one of those pyres of Jews who were undressed, about to be sent to death in the crematoria, and their bodies later would be burned in the open air in this part of the camp. Here we see two more images made by this unknown photographer. His name is sometimes given as Alex, although as far as I know, we don't actually know his name. These are pictures that were certainly made at the risk to this prisoner's life. And the pictures have become so important and so iconic that if you visit Birkenau today, you'll see them actually installed in the landscape at the camp as it exists, with explanatory texts in more than one language. And the give and take between seeing the photograph and looking around the photograph at the landscape, that give and take between the image and the earth around it, is the memorial act as it's being constructed now at Birkenau. Okay, finally, we have a collection of photographs from the liberator's point of view. And these photographs are a distinct category within the photography of the Holocaust. Once again, we have the use of photography as an official tool, although this time it's not a propaganda tool being used by the perpetrators, but it's a tool for recording the crimes of the defeated Germans. And we also have the use of photography as what I would call a sort of quasi-official tool for managing the image of the genocide, managing the memory of the genocide, summarizing it, I would say often minimizing and understating it. The first appearance in the Western press of the American press of the Holocaust occurs on a single page in Life magazine in August 1944, following the liberation of the Majdanek camp in Lublin. We have 6 photographs printed small on the page around a text, all of it juxtaposed, as was always the case in these picture magazines, against a full page advertisement for Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. A morbid juxtaposition, unintentional, but very telling. And the text here is called Lublin Funeral. So what we have here is the aftermath of the genocide as it was experienced in one corner of the Nazi concentration area system. And we have, for the first time, images of piles of corpses, and we have also on the lower left, we have an image of one of the ovens, and also at the far left, a group of several of the ovens from the crematorium at Majdanek. Majdanek, by the way, for those of you who have not been to Holocaust land, as I call it, Majdanek is the camp that is the most intact camp. It's the place where you can see most clearly what the camp actually looked like at the time that it operated. It was overrun quickly, and the Germans did not have a chance to destroy it, as happened in the others. On October 1st, 1945, we have the first appearance of the Holocaust in a German picture magazine. This is the Neue Berliner Illustrierte. And in this case, we have a kind of summary of several camps, a distillation of the genocidal crimes into emblematic or iconic, what the picture editors certainly regarded as iconic pictures of the genocide. In London, the April 28, 1945 image of the Illustrated News establishes the main visual elements of what becomes the image of the Holocaust, which is the centers on the pile of corpses. The corpse pile becomes essential to all the liberation photographs. And in a somewhat critical reading of this visual trope, one can see this as a way of sort of making the chaos and the obscenity of the Holocaust somehow approachable, generalizable, or summed up. And so we see, for example, famously, George Roger, the English photojournalist, George Rogers' pictures from April 1945 from Bergen-Belsen. And the pile of corpses, whether in ditches or in the open air, become the symbol of the Holocaust, the graphic symbol of what's happened. Although it isn't only corpses that are carrying the symbolic weight of the Holocaust. We have here a famous picture from Buchenwald by the American photographer Margaret Bourke-White, traveling with the liberators. And here she makes a picture that is famously called the living dead of Buchenwald. The German camps, Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, especially become the main point of contact of the Western press with the camp system and with the mass murder that occurred in the camp system. Although for those people who later go on to study the Holocaust, of course, these camps are just in a sense the tip of the concentrationary system, of the camp system, and don't even begin really to describe everything that there is to describe about that one aspect of the Holocaust. But anyway, nonetheless, Margaret Bourke-White here uses survivors dressed still in their camp clothing, sometimes with other clothes that they've found or been given. And here they assemble behind a barbed wire fence. They hold the fence, they touch the fence, something of course that they never would have done during the Holocaust itself, because that fence would have been electrified and would have killed them. But here they touch the fence, and these are the images of survivors. Now on May 7th, 1945, Life magazine publishes the most extensive account of the Holocaust. The title or the lead image of that issue of Life was actually the German people and what the German people faced in the aftermath of the war. But we find inside the most extensive coverage of the liberation photography that Life ever did. Several pages devoted to the discoveries by American troops and the photographs made by photographers accompanying them, of a level of graphic detail that I think one would not find in even today in conflict situations. And the leading idea for this was that the photographs are the living proof. The photographs are the living proof of the crimes of the Nazis, that it was necessary to publish these images in order, because they were so unbelievable and unprecedented, that without actually showing them to the public wouldn't believe that all of this actually occurred. And so Life magazine takes the extraordinary step of showing in gruesome and graphic detail the remains of burnings, of people, of mass murder, of corpses, and so forth. Okay. Altogether, if I were to describe, if we take all of these strands of photographs and this whole diverse archive and put it together, if I had to leave you with one thought, I think the thought would be that the photographic archive that we have of the Holocaust is rather similar to a document like this. This is a testament from a Jewish prisoner working at Auschwitz who wrote a part of his testimony on what he did on a piece of paper. And this is the piece of paper that he left us. And the text is very difficult to read. If we can discern some things from the text. He says, introduced the gas. We carried the corpses of these innocent women, which was brought to the oven and put inside an oven there and forced us to put it through a coarse sieve, and it was later loaded onto a car and shaken into the river which flowed nearby, and they covered over all traces. The dramas which my eyes have seen are indescribable. Approximately 600,000 Jews from Hungary, French people, Poles. This is what we can pull out of this text, but the image itself, the image of this text itself, I would submit, is rather like the visual archive of the Holocaust. It's direct, and it's and it testifies to what happened, but it requires a great deal of work and reading in order to pull that testimony forward. And so it actually exists in a certain state of ambiguity as well as directness. Okay, this is the end of my presentation, and I feel like I went a bit quickly through some parts of it, but Tomek, this is the end slide, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Jason. It was very, I think that everyone agrees that it was very powerful set of images. And it's hard to say something after seeing them and after discussing them. Thank you, Jason.
I'm happy to try to answer questions.
Yeah, there was one question for sure. There was a question when you showed this set of images. This would you refer to as ambiguous images? You showed them silently. The question was, how did you collect them? How did you get to them? How did you find them? If
the internet allowed you to see it, you would have seen the dot pattern in many of these pictures. I started in the 90s. I started photographing, making copy photographs from of these images wherever I could find them. In books, in museums, in anywhere I could find them, I would just start collecting them. And by now I have quite a large collection of them from many different sources. These are all second order representations of them, but yeah, it was an unsystematic process.
Okay. Any other questions? If you guys feel like asking Jason, this lecture is being recorded, and sorry for some technical issues that we had at one point. We will be publishing this lecture online on our website and on our Facebook and in our YouTube channel. We will try to add the subtitles to these few places that are maybe not audible. Another question, Jason. What's the role of photographers of remnants of Jewish life that still exists? Do you see the chat, Jason?
Yes, I do see. I do see that question. That's a very good question, and it's a complicated question. There's been, as I mentioned in the talk, there have been photographers photographing remnant Jewish life, really since the late 1950s, and moving into the 60s, and especially in the 70s and 80s, there were quite a lot of photographers who took this subject on, and in a certain period in the 70s and into the 80s, it was often framed as the last. We're looking at the last Jews, the end of the 1,000-year civilization is here, in this place and in this community, in this other community. It's a very elegiac practice. I think that moment has passed. That type of practice has passed now, and I think that there are really two things that distinguish the work that photographers are doing now. One thing is a kind of just a sheer documentation of what remains of the Jewish world that existed before the war, and with more and more detail and more critical awareness, less and less generalization, more sensitivity to the competing narratives that interpret that world. And this is in a way the very work of the Galicia Jewish Museum. Its core exhibition about the Polish side of historical Galicia, and also the other exhibition on the Ukrainian side, which I did a few years ago, attempt just that, to critically read what exists. And there's an enormous amount of change that's happened in the landscape of memory, and these projects really show memory as a living, growing, activated thing, a site of contest and meaning. The other thing is that there are Jewish communities that are living, that are not remnants, they're not mere remnants of something, but they're actual living communities, and they often don't abide by sort of stereotypes that other people have of people lost in time, marooned lives, and so forth. It's not like that. These are living communities, the in and of places as much as any Jews living anywhere. And I think that those projects are also emerging as very much of our time and very valuable.
Yeah, Jason, you have two more questions, and I think that this is the last two questions that we have time to answer.
Yeah.
From Aviva and from Joel.
Mm-hmm. Joel is asking whether smuggled photographs appeared in Vorwärts before the Time Life photographs first appeared. I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't think they did. I think they didn't.
Yeah, I don't know. We can look that up, but if it happened, I'm not aware of it. Maybe it did. I'm not certain. And from Aviva Atlani, many testimonies discuss the limits of language. Do photographs circumnavigate the barriers of language in an age in which the non-visual is resurrected in a non-Holocaust landscape? That's a very loaded and thick question. Do they circumnavigate the barriers of language? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that that we find that images are acts of showing and not of telling. No, in the sense that it requires language to begin to mediate and make sense of what a picture shows. I don't think that the pictures are self-meaningful. I think that there are many layers of meaning that are attending all of these photographs. And in a way, each of the many photographs that I showed you today could be the subject of an extended reading or many extended readings. And those readings are, I think, are particular to the act of attempting to engage with the subject. And we can't take for granted that these readings are obvious to people, especially when the specific historical contexts are either not known by people or that they're in themselves opaque. Yes, there is, the question about revisionism and the continued use of the photographs as proof against revisionists. Yes, I think that that's extremely important. And in that sense, the original mandate of the liberation photographers stands, that these images should stand as a kind of testimony. But the question is whether that testimony can speak itself. And I think that to some extent it does, but only to a certain extent. And beyond that, it requires an active engagement with the images in their context to really understand what the testimony is.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you for spending time with us.
I'm speaking this, I feel like this answer that I've given is unsatisfactory, and partly because this is a question of, this is a dialogue, this is an invitation to dialogue, and that's not the form that we have here.
Yeah.
But okay.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your kind words. Thank you, everyone, for spending 2 hours, almost 2 hours with us. As I said, we will be publishing this lecture. Some of the photographs that Jason showed already were published in the application that I mentioned at the beginning, and it was not coordinated with Jason. Some of them will show. We will have some photographs that Jason didn't mention, like Walter Genevine, for example, who is another photographer from the Warsaw Ghetto, also taking color photographs. Thank you. In around a month, we will have another meeting from the series. We will announce the speaker or speakers within next week or so. So I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye bye.
Thank you to everyone who participated.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. This was fascinating. This was really fascinating. I think everyone agrees with me on this. Hear you soon. Talk to you soon. Bye, guys. Bye bye.